Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. In 1857, the composer Johannes Brahms published a piece called Variations on an Original Theme, Opus 21, number 1 if you care. In it, he used a fairly common form in classical music called theme and variations, where you start with a cool melodic idea, either something you wrote yourself or borrowed from another composer, and then play around with it in different ways, effectively writing a series of miniature pieces that flow into each other, tied together by the general shape of the initial theme. And it's a fine piece, not one of his most famous, but whatever, who cares? That's not what I'm interested in here. What matters is that in Variation 5, bars 6 and 7, the left hand is instructed to play this. Now, normally I'd record a sample so you could hear what it sounds like, but in this case, I can't. Not because it's particularly hard to play. It's a pretty straightforward line. It just happens to be impossible. Let me explain. So, alright, what's the problem with this rhythm? Well, let's break it down. We've got stems going in both directions, which means this part has two distinct voices running through it, two melodic lines that the left hand is supposed to play simultaneously. In the bottom line, Brahms says to play straight 16th notes, while in the top line, he's asking for 16th note triplets. And that's level 1 of this problem. The two parts are subdividing differently. For each 8th note that passes by, the bottom line plays 2 evenly spaced notes while the top line plays 3. The parts don't line up, but that's not impossible, it's just a polyrhythm. Tricky, maybe, but well within the realms of human capability, especially at this tempo. A talented piano player would have no problem reproducing this, or at least they wouldn't if that was the only thing going on here. But if we look closely at this notation, we see another little wrinkle. Many of the notes in these two voices share the same note head. So, like here on the downbeat, we see that not only are both lines playing E, they're playing the same E. And this is, again, a pretty normal thing. It's a way of showing when two lines converge to make it easier to visualize their shapes. To use a simpler example, consider this. Here we have one line that alternates between B and C while the other line walks up and down the scale. They both happen to hit B at the same time on beat 3, so instead of arbitrarily deciding which one gets to use the note head, we just let them both have it. This lets us clearly see how each line is moving in and out of the shared note, and it also avoids having to include an awkward rest in one of the melodies. We can even do this with different durations. If we slow the top line down, this pitch becomes both a quarter note and an 8th note simultaneously. On piano, where each note can only be played once at any given time, this is mostly just an issue of convenience and readability, but for, say, a choral piece, where each line is sung by a different voice, this sort of notation becomes extremely important as a way of communicating that both people should sing this note together. But let's go back to our Brahms piece. If we look at the note on the downbeat, things are fine. The two lines want to hold this note for different lengths, but whatever, that's allowed. However, if we skip ahead to this note, we've got a problem. Remember, the combined note head means that these two voices are not only playing the same pitch, they're playing the same attack. So when does that attack happen? Well, if we look at the bottom voice, it happens 1 16th note after the beat. But if we look at the top voice, it happens 2 16th note triplets after the beat. Those aren't the same thing. As such, a strictly literal reading of this notation says that a single attack, a single strike of the piano key, must happen simultaneously at 2 different points in time. That's impossible. And yet here we are. On the surface, this reminds me of that math meme that floats around Twitter sometimes, where someone posts an equation like this, asks what the answer is, and people get into huge fights about the order of operations. Folks from the US mostly learned it as PEMDAS, which puts multiplication before division, resulting in an answer of 1. Folks from many other English-speaking countries were instead taught BODMAS, where division comes before multiplication, giving an answer of 16. Others may have learned that the two are equivalent, so you just do them in the order they're written, again giving 16, while still others learned that this sort of multiplication where the number is written next to the parentheses with no time symbol is higher priority, which would give 1. And it goes on like this, with everyone yelling at everyone else when the actual answer is that this is just bad mathematical notation. The intent is unclear, and any serious mathematician would just include another set of parentheses to resolve the ambiguity. But that's not actually what's going on here. In the math example, the equation was purposefully designed to create notational controversy. It's not from a paper or an exam or anything like that, it's just a way to get people riled up by communicating poorly. But in the musical example, I didn't make it up. Brahms did, and he did it in a real piece of music that he presumably intended people to be able to play. He had a specific sound he wanted to hear, and this was how he chose to communicate that sound. And he wasn't the only one either. In his paper on this rhythm, Dr. Julian Hook identifies similar impossible notations in the works of many important composers from across the 19th century, including Felix Mendelssohn, Sergei Rachmaninoff, Clara and Robert Schumann, Franz Liszt, Amy Beach, and Claude Debussy. It seems unlikely that all these composers conspired to play a century-long practical joke on their readers, but if they had a specific rhythm in mind here, then we're gonna have to figure out what it was. Fortunately for us, Brahms was a talented pianist who would often play his own pieces, and his performances of this one should give us a pretty clear indication of what he thought this notation meant. Unfortunately, any such performances took place before the advent of mainstream audio recording technology, so we have no idea what they sounded like. We're just gonna have to guess. In his paper, Dr. Hook lays out 4 possible interpretations, each of which breaks one of the 3 assumptions we've been making up to this point. The first option is to simply ignore the fact that the 2 lines share a note head. We play the 16th notes evenly and we play the triplets evenly, and we accept that as a natural consequence of those decisions, this one note cannot represent one attack. Instead, it sounds twice in rapid succession. And yeah, that's a valid reading, but there's a couple problems. First of all, it sounds bad. Or, okay, it's not the worst, but has this stumbling, awkward quality to it that draws way too much attention to the left-hand part when the focus is supposed to be on the right-hand melody. It's also really difficult to play. Again, the piano only has 1 key per note, so in order to do this correctly, you have to strike the key, lift up, then strike again in a very small, precise window. And since the right hand is busy with its own thing, and the left-hand part spans over an octave at times, you probably have to do it all with 1 finger. It's not impossible, but it's very physically challenging and not stylistically appropriate, so it seems unlikely that this is what Brahms had in mind. A more plausible answer comes from Hook's second interpretation. We just assume the triplets are correct and work from there. This forces the 16th note line to stretch out, aligning its offbeat attacks with the triplet pattern in order to resolve the metric discrepancy. According to Hook, this is the approach that pretty much every performer of the piece takes, and it's the only one that allows for a nice, even rhythmic bed for the right-hand melody to sit on top of. That melody is playing straight 16ths, which means we've got a polyrhythm, but that's fine, Brahms used those. Of course, this approach still has its own problems. For starters, Hook argues that it may contradict the structure of the piece. Variation 5 is what's called a canon in inversion, which means the left-hand part is mirroring the right-hand part, but upside down. When the right hand goes up, the left goes down by the same amount, and vice versa on a 2-bar delay. But again, the right hand is playing straight 16ths, and the part of the left hand that mirrors it is the one marked with straight 16ths as well. The extra notes from the triplet line only play a low bass note in the middle. They're not a part of the canon structure. This relationship between the melodies of the 2 hands implies that when the left hand performs its response, it does so in straight 16ths, not as a triplet. But there's also a more fundamental issue here. If Brahms had meant for this to be played as a constant stream of triplets, why didn't he write that? It wouldn't be hard to do. You just have to turn these from straight 16ths to 8th note triplets and boom, problem solved. In fact, why even have a second voice at all? The triplet part hits all the notes the other one does, so why not just write it like this and be done with it? What purpose does the second line serve? Keep that question in mind, we'll be coming back to it. A lot. But okay, let's say we're convinced by these arguments that the more important line is in fact the straight 16ths. How does that sound? Well, Hook offers 2 options. The first of these is to say that since we're moving the last triplet forward to align with the straight note, we should also move the middle one forward so it still divides the space evenly. That sounds like this. And I'm unconvinced. Again, we have to ask why he would choose to notate it like this when he could just use 32nd notes instead, especially when he's more than happy to use them elsewhere in the piece. This is a possible reading, but I don't think it's a very compelling one. The better option, I think, is Hook's 4th interpretation, where the middle note stays still and only the last one gets pushed forward, creating a sort of galloping rhythm between the two lines that evokes the implied polyrhythm without having to deal with those awkward repeated notes. Personally, I really like this version, partly because it sounds nice and partly because it seems to be the one that's most usefully notated the way Brahms did it. There's still other ways to write this, and they may technically be clearer, but they're relatively complex and difficult to read compared to the alternatives for our other versions. It's not a perfect interpretation, but I think it makes a lot of sense. Or at least it would if it weren't for the fact that this entire time we've been making one extremely dangerous unspoken assumption. We've been assuming that Brahms intended for this rhythm to be read precisely. And in a world of drum machines and prog rock, that makes a lot of sense. That's how most of us interact with musical time. But the thing about history is that sometimes things were different in the past. Shocking, I know. These days we're used to studio recordings made with the aid of click tracks and quantizing software, allowing for extremely precise time feels if the artist wants, but in the 19th century, all they had to go on was vibes. Time vibes, if you will. And that doesn't mean they were worse at keeping time than we were. It means they had a completely different idea of what being good at keeping time meant. Most pieces from the Romantic era, especially ones for solo instruments like this, were written with the expectation that the performer would employ some level of rubato, speeding up and slowing down the tempo for the sake of expression. With those sorts of time vibes, the difference between a 16th note and a 16th note triplet isn't very big. Even at the extremely slow tempo of around 40 BPM that most recordings of this piece seem to use, the two attacks are only an eighth of a second apart. In principle, that's a pretty noticeable difference, but when the tempo is already ebbing and flowing, it can easily melt away. You can start to convince yourself that these two metric positions do happen at the same time, even if the score says they can't. Because of that, I'd assume that Brahms was probably thinking of this as basically using the triplet interpretation. He just wasn't all that worried about the possible misalignment. And since that's what pretty much every recorded version of the piece does, I suspect I'm not alone here. But if so, that still leaves us with one annoying little question. If that's what he meant, why did he choose to notate it like this? It may be the most reasonable way for us to read what he wrote, but that doesn't make it the most reasonable way for him to write what he intended us to read. It's unnecessarily cluttered, and it doesn't clearly and unambiguously communicate his intent, so it's still bad notation. Right? Well, only if we assume that rhythm is the only thing he wanted us to read here. So far, we've only been talking about Variation 5, but if we're looking for another explanation for this weird notation choice, it turns out there might be a clue earlier on in the same piece. All the way back in Variation 1, he instructs the right hand to play this. And again, we have two different voices, marked by two different stem directions, with shared note heads. But this time, the rhythm makes even less sense. Taken literally, this attack is a full quarter note after the downbeat in one voice, but in the other voice, the only note before it is this one, so the same attack must happen in eighth note after the downbeat. But that is, of course, an absurd way to interpret this notation. Instead, it seems much more reasonable to say that this second voice only exists on the first and third beats of each bar, and is simply not there in between. But why do that? Again, it's just doubling the first voice. It's not adding a harmony or anything else new. It conveys no information about rhythm or pitch, so why include it at all? I think what he's trying to do with this is connect this walk down back to the pickup at the start of the line. The second voice communicates information not about rhythm, but about phrasing. It says these two notes are doing the same thing as these two notes, and you, as the performer, should play them the same way. You should think of them as setting up the start of the next bar, not the conclusion of the current one. And I think that's roughly what he's doing in Variation 5 as well. Remember, this variation is a canon in inversion, and the straight 16th line is the one that contains that important structural element. But if we just write out the triplets, that connection isn't immediately visible. It looks like the left hand is just jumping around, so you, the performer, might miss the underlying relationship between the two hands, and thus fail to bring it out in your playing. By adding a second notated line, he's presenting a sort of preemptive analysis of his own work, a melodic reduction that explains to the reader how the piece is intended to be read. So it's not actually an impossible rhythm, because it's not a rhythm at all. Now, is any of that true? I don't know. I'm not a Brahms scholar, I'm just some doofus with a YouTube channel and an uncomfortably high budget for Sharpies. But there is some textual evidence to support it. In the first edition of the piece, by Brahms's regular publisher Fritz Simrock, bar 3 of Variation 5 looks like this, with the top voice playing sixteenths and the bottom voice playing triplets. In bar 4, though, he writes this, and the two have switched, with the top voice playing triplets and the bottom playing sixteenths. If this were actually meant to reflect two distinct melodic voices, that would be a really strange strange decision. The lines are jumping back and forth between two different rhythmic patterns, seemingly at random. But there is one thing that unites these two bars. In both cases, the stems for the triplet voice are pointing in the correct direction. They go down when the notes are above the middle of the staff, and up when they're below. And later, in the second half of the section, he stops notating the 16th note line entirely, even though the canon structure keeps going, probably because he feels like you've got the point. This implies, to me at least, that there was never supposed to be a second melodic line. The triplets are the only actual melody here, which is why throughout the section, they're consistently the one that's notated correctly. That's what the left hand is supposed to be playing, and the other set of stems is meant to communicate something much more subtle and nuanced. And that's the thing about notation. It's easy to think of written music as an objective record of sounds, but it's not. Notation is just symbols. Symbols require context, and over time that context gets lost. Brahms almost certainly didn't write it like this to be mysterious. On the contrary, he tended to be a pretty meticulous notator, and his works, including this one, were often full of precise performance instructions. He wanted you to know exactly how you were supposed to play his stuff. He wrote it like this because he assumed that the people who were going to read it would know what he meant. And he was probably right. Again, lots of other Romantic composers did the same thing. This was a recognizable symbol among his target audience. But we're not his target audience. We're looking at his work from a century and a half in the future. In that time, music has changed considerably, and so has the way we write it down, so now we're left with this strange notational mystery, not because he was unclear, but because he was speaking a different musical language. And hey, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sundgaard, Duck, Howard Levine, Warren Huart, Kevin Wilamowski, Grant Aldonas, and Damian Fuller Sutherland. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. Oh, and don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.